Welcome to the NCFE podcast, a podcast dedicated to training, education, lifelong learning, and supporting progression into sustainable employment from leading education charity NCFE, featuring guests from across the sector.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another NCFE podcast. My name is Paul Turner, and I'm the Policy Specialist at NCFE and your host for this particular session. We have a number of guests today to discuss what the podcast and the theme of today is, which is diverse spaces and the importance of representation and inclusion. I'd like to introduce each and every one of the guests today. So first of all, if I just call you by your first name, and then if you can just give us a little bit about who you are, excuse me, who you work for, and a little bit about your involvement with diversity. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Isa.
Hi, good morning. My name is Isa. I run an organization called the Birmingham Apprenticeship Alliance, and the purpose of our organization is that we're an employer and provide a tech platform that allows organizations to educate them on anything and everything related to diversity and inclusion, engage with Black, Asian, and multi-ethnic communities, and also recruit from them. And our work with NCFE goes back to about 2017. They were one of our early partners in the formation of the Alliance, and it all involves around promoting apprenticeship diversity and better understanding how we can break down barriers to access talent from underrepresented communities.
Wonderful, thanks, Isa. Okay, next on my list, I see Sidhani. Sidhani, please.
Hi, I'm Siddhani. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm Head of Education and Youth at Stonewall, which is a lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, questioning and ace, so LGBTQ plus equality charity. And we imagine a world where all LGBTQ plus people are free to be themselves and live our lives to the full. And the way that I do that, I suppose, is more specifically with schools, colleges, any children or young person facing service. But as an organisation, we also work with employers to create equality for all LGBTQ plus people.
Wonderful, thank you. Dan.
Hi there, my name is Dan Howard. I'm Director of Operations at NCFE. I'm also Chair of our Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And I'm also very proud to be a patron of the BAME Apprenticeship Alliance, the organisation run by Isa, and also a judge of the BAME Apprenticeship Awards as well.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And Jeff.
Hi everyone, I'm Jeff Greenwich. I'm the Director for Diversity at the Association of Colleges and the Education and Training Foundation. Two organisations have come together to support this role, and both from different perspectives really. The AOC as a membership organisation for the FE sector looking to support their colleges, and the ETF, workforce development right across the sector, looking to understand and to help the sector to become more diverse and more inclusive.
Wonderful, thank you very much, everyone. Okay, so let's get stuck into the topic itself. First of all, I think I'm just going to throw this open to anybody who wants to answer it or put their hands up, or if everybody wants to have a go at this one. Diversity in the UK, how is it? What is it like? Is it there? Is it fully represented? Is it underrepresented? How long have we actually been, sort of looking at this as an area which is really, really important? Right, who am I going to pick first? Go on, Jeff, after you.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, though. Is diversity there? Do you know what? Diversity exists. We have absolutely no choice about it. We are all very, very different. We're different in terms of our ethnicity, we're different in terms of our gender, we're different in terms of our thoughts. So for me, diversity is something which exists. I think the real challenge that we have as individuals and of organisations is understanding how best to make the most of that diversity. So that's what I'd put on the table first of all for us to discuss. I think it just exists. And same thing with equality. Equality, there are laws laid down around equality. We as individuals and as organisations, we've got a couple of main things that we can really impact on. One is the way we include people, within our organisations, and secondly, it's about equity, how we ensure that people get that chance that they need to really progress and to develop. So there, Paul, that's my sort of opening gambit, really.
I think I'll come in next if that's okay. So I agree with Jeff's points in relation to what he has said. We have diversity all around us, up and down the country in the communities where we live and work. I think it's the distinct difference between what is seen as diversity but inclusion, and absolutely right from Jeff's point around that inclusion and equity, not only within the workplace but within everyday life. And I think we have legislation in place around the Equality Act, for example. But for me, diversity and inclusion goes so much further than what are the protected characteristics of the Equality Act. So if you think about socioeconomic, if you think about neurodiversity, it's so important to make sure that all walks of life and communities are represented fairly, and that difference is celebrated and not seen as something that divides us.
I think what's important to recognise from the points here that we've just heard is that what it means to all of us here and everybody around us is it means something different to each and every one of us. We've all got different understandings of what diversity, equity, inclusion means. What we as an organisation, part of one of our tools is called the Apprenticeship Hack, and one of them is where we get apprentices and employers together and their employers together and trying to, it's called understanding or exploring diversity, equity, inclusion for the purpose of understanding. You've got the definition there. What does it mean to you, you, and you? Because we'll all bring different things to the table. But what we will see is that there is a common objective in and amongst what each of these what they mean to us. And coming from my perspective, where we're looking at Black, Asian, multi-ethnic talent, early talent and talent within an organization, it's not just about representation, it's also about having access, and having access to high quality opportunities, having access to high quality opportunities to get into something but also progress within a particular field. I think, and I would say that that's just not, it's not an isolated thing when it comes to when it comes to the Black, Asian and multi-ethnic representation, but it's also in all the different fractions of or the intersectionalities of diversity and the protected characteristics.
Thank you. And adding to everything that's already been said, I think one of the things that we tend to trip up on is seeing people through one lens or one identity. And we know that intersectionality is so important. So when we're talking about LGBTQ plus inclusion, for example, it's only true inclusion if that includes LGBTQ people of colour, LGBTQ disabled people of colour who are also LGBTQ. And those are the nuances that I think are really important in any work around diversity, because even if you look at the statistics or the information or the data that we haven't really been recording sexual orientation, for example, as part of the census, for example. So the data that we might have, or to be able to understand where communities exist, how out and open they might feel, and then whether they feel included, isn't I guess it isn't a fair playing field. And so that's why diversity is an important area to commit to and to continue working on.
Just staying with you there, Siddhani, we'll talk about the education sector because that's what we're involved in. What is diversity like within the sector? And obviously I'll throw it open to everybody else as well, but from your point of view, looking at the education sector, how is diversity, to an extent doing? Is it fully there? Is it really represented with regards to the whole spectrum of what the education sector is about?
It's a good question, and I think we have so much further to go. So if you look at the staffing structures around every school or college, for example, and specifically if you look at the history, so the legacy of Section 28, which forbid the promotion of homosexuality, that was brought in 1988, and Stonewall was founded to repeal it in 1989. That was only repealed in 2003 in England and Wales. And then since then, you haven't really had any guidance about how you should talk about LGBTQ plus people, families, relationships, until the recent RSHE guidance. So you've got a legacy of not being able to talk about LGBTQ plus people, to being able to talk about them, but not necessarily given a lot of confidence or tools to be able to do so. And I think that impacts to what extent people feel able to bring their whole selves to work. And that's just as a staff team. Then if you think about LGBTQ plus children and young people as they're growing, finding out which labels fit them and to what extent they're represented in the curriculum. And then again, I'd say like some schools and colleges are doing great work. They do incredible things to celebrate LGBT History Month every February, for example. But sometimes I'll go in and I'll see an incredible board dedicated to diversity, but it will only show white gay men, for example. And there are so many different ways to being LGBTQ+. So I guess what I'm talking about is like the staffing and the structures, the pupils themselves, and then their educational experience in the setting. And I think we have come a long way and we have so much further to go.
Yeah. Okay, Dan first, and then I'll bring Jeff in. Dan.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with what Sidhani has said there, and we have come a long way, and I think it's certainly on not just within the education sector, but within business communities in general. I think it's certainly on the agenda more than it has been historically. If you think about equality, diversity, and inclusion holistically, so I think it's certainly on the agenda within the education sector. I think there's some phenomenal examples of best practice and work being done. I think there's still work to do. I think we, still have a long way to go to truly embed, inclusion and equality and diversity. And it's interesting when setting up the diversity inclusion committee internally across our educational organisation. Like we were really thinking, okay, what does success look like? What are the outcomes? How do we know we've done what we set out to achieve? And it was really interesting because in our last meeting we said, for us, success is when we don't need to have this meeting anymore. Success is when we don't need to have a specific committee and a set of objectives relating to the DNA of our organisation. And also, the psychological safety of our people. So, it's getting better within the education system, absolutely, but there is still a way to go for everyone to feel safe and included within the workplace, within a space of education and learning, and in everyday life.
Definitely. In a nutshell, diversity becomes business as usual, doesn't it? It becomes something that you no longer need to talk about or discuss. It's there, and it's always there.
Thinking about the education sector, okay, the way we will get that outcome where it becomes part of business as usual is through education. It's through, developing people's knowledge, their understanding. I'm a big believer that everyone's opinion is relevant. If that's their opinion, they're entitled to it, and everyone's opinion is respected. However, through education, through understanding, I know NCFE, for example, have a qualification in relation to, equality and diversity. And we've seen a lot of uptake on that recently. I think it's a level 2 certificate. And we've seen a lot of learners going through that. But through the power of education, we can ensure that equality, diversity and inclusion becomes business as usual.
Brilliant. Jeff?
I think everyone said what I was going to say, really. In that yes, the data is important, but I think what Sidhani was saying about not talking about it is really crucial. We've got to get to a place where we as adults feel comfortable talking about difficult conversations. Having those difficult conversations, because part of what's stopping us, I think, from making progress is fear. Is fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of not knowing what to say in particular circumstances. But you know what? If we can begin to have those conversations, I'd say as adults, that creates a space for the young people to do what they really want to do. I'm heartened because I think young people, everyone's younger than me, but I think young people have something about them, this generation, which is making waves. They're beginning to shift things. I look at a couple of examples from the education sector. In West Suffolk College, when we had the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's murder last year, they set about understanding what this Black Lives Matter stuff was all about. Now, these are white students. They went and researched it, understood it, and then they went back into their organisation and said to their teachers, "Do you know what? We need to do this." as part of our curriculum. So they were making waves there. They were making changes, and I'm sure it's happening there. You see it happening with Malala Yousafzai. You see it happening with Greta Thunberg. Young people, for me, are key to this, and we need almost to get out of the way and let them support them in what they're doing. So I'm heartened. The other thing, back to what Dan was saying about getting inclusion as part of the DNA. It's absolutely right. You shouldn't need jobs like my particular role. Inclusion is something that needs to be expected. We should be able to go into an organisation and expect to be included and almost demand to be included. And I think, again, as this millennial group are going through, they are of that nature. They have expectations that we ought to be able to satisfy. So I'm actually agreeing with what people are saying. But the point I'm adding is that there's something about fear there. And we're afraid to have conversations, and it's about time we perhaps grew up and had those conversations.
Definitely, I was just about to say it's the growing up, isn't it? That's required now. Perhaps that's the hardest part for some people to do. They prefer to stay where they're at rather than actually open up and grow up a little bit. Isa.
Yeah, I was just going to add to Dan's point actually, because I think everybody's adding to Dan's point. I think the conversation won't go away, and it will probably be going on for a very long time, because the nature of DEI it evolves all the time. If you look at the word leadership and how leadership has evolved over time, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no leadership in terms of, or there's no good leadership, etc. What's happened is the leadership over time has evolved because the times have changed, and I think that will happen with DEI. Where I agree with Dan is that it needs to be an embedded part of the process whereby it's not just an add-on; it's more an integral part of the organization. Now, there are some very good case studies behind this, whereby you not necessarily have to. The good example is whereby when we look at, I know obviously the football the football arenas and football scene has had a lot of racism, etc. But when we look at teams, we don't necessarily identify them and separate them based on their color or ethnicity or where they come from. We talk about them because of the skills, the knowledge, skills, and talent they bring to the teams. In a similar manner, that's how, when we look at organizations, we should look at them as their skills, talent, and just by chance they are, from a Pakistani background or an Indian background or Jamaican background, just by chance that's the talent so that's the representation. I mean, sports is a classic example whereby internally they have, they pick people based on talent, and because it has an impact not just on the player, but it also has it on the organization, because they thrive, they do well. Unfortunately, obviously, externally they've had the problems come from external issues. Reverse that when you look at organizations, and if you look at from an organization perspective, if you recruit people based on the talent they possess, but you go to a pool, and you got access to the right pool, you got access to the right communities, that's going to where the conversation of DI becomes more of a thing, a strand, rather than a big conversation. It becomes embedded within the organization.
Wonderful. A lot to mention about young people. Obviously, the future of the country. There's a lot of information out there, a lot of easily accessible information, some of which is right and some of which is questionable. How do we ensure that our young people, get access to the right, the legitimate information? What kind of things do we need to do? What do we need to put controls in place on certain aspects of media, etc., or is it something that we take forward, let the young people take forward and move it forward themselves? Isa?
I think we've got to start. So the easiest part is talking about recruitment, getting more outreach. So the easiest part is talking about outreach and talking about how we can get more talent in, etc. That's probably the more easier conversation now, because there's been an overemphasis on it. Where the emphasis hasn't been is on the longevity of that young person coming into the organization. So you've got obviously from my perspective, when we're talking about apprenticeships and apprentices, when they come into the organization, their apprenticeship span is about 1.5 to 2 years. After that, there is evidence to show that black, Asian, minority ethnic talent do not thrive within the organization for one primary reason. The culture of the organization is not right for them to thrive. It's based on traditional old principles of, right, get on, do your job. And it's about building that culture to say, having the different conversations, having the space, the safe space to thrive and have the conversations that you need to have, but also building that internal support network in place so that when that person needs to ask the questions, they want to ask the questions about to increase their own knowledge, skills, and behaviors, then they've got that. One last thing I would say is sponsorship. And I don't mean sponsorship for events that are out there. I mean sponsorships for individuals to pick up the skills they need, get the qualifications they need, and also get the experiences they need to get into the next phase of their talent progression.
Wonderful. Sidoni?
So I'm not quite sure what you have in mind with the question, but if I answer from LGBTQ plus young people and their communities, because if you think about the silence that was imposed by Section 28 and the legacy of that, the really crushing legacy of that in terms of confidence of teachers or any practitioner in talking about LGBTQ plus communities with any young person, the internet and alternative sources of information has been a really powerful tool for some LGBTQ plus young people to find language about how they identify, and also to if you think about like how an LGBTQ plus young person might be the only one in their community, they might come out at different stages of their lifetime. How they feel about the labels that they choose for themselves might change over time. So the internet can be a really powerful tool in realizing that you're not the only one. There are some things that are universal and shared and some things that are different. And really empowering young people to go back to their college and say, I need you to put this provision in place. I need you to be able to call me by a different pronoun. I need, and this is actually a right of mine. That said, of course, the internet isn't incredibly safe all the time. And that's why I think it comes back to relationship, sex and health education and PSHE. And if the curriculum is truly representative, so when you're talking about online relationships and when you're talking about what safe and healthy relationships look like, you include LGBTQ plus examples, then the children and young people are so much better equipped for any risk-taking behaviour that might happen after that, because obviously you want to minimise that. So there's a good side to it and there is a challenging side to it. And I think it comes back to what curriculum, education, skills and tools are we providing for young people.
I agree completely and wholeheartedly. I think it doesn't just need to happen within education, it needs to happen within businesses. And I think there is a fear amongst educators and leaders and managers of getting it wrong and saying the wrong thing. And, I firmly believe that good leadership is inclusive. Whether it be in an educational establishment or any other industry. And through the power of leadership, being able to ensure that your colleagues, your peers have a safe space to work, to learn, is fundamental. But there is a fear of getting it wrong and saying the wrong thing. And I think that is a barrier for people in order to drive the agenda further forward than where it's at the moment. I'll use a personal example. I'm a member of the LGBTQ plus community myself. I have a child, and all he knows is that I'm his dad, regardless of the fact that I'm attracted to men and not women. His mother is also gay, so she's always been attracted to women. All my son at age 8 knows is that he's got a mum and dad that love him, and that's all that matters. And I think inclusion goes across everything. And I know that my son, as he grows up, will be a very diverse, well-respected member of society, because the way he thinks, the way he articulates himself at a very young age is very intelligent. And that's because of his exposure to diversity, his exposure to what isn't different, but what other people see as different. And I think it's really important that we get that into education at a very young age. So, things like, the RSHE curriculum in schools. I'm chair of governors for a primary school, and Ofsted, when they're looking at the education inspection framework, they're focused on the curriculum, the intent of that curriculum, the implementation and impact of it. So when I'm sat with Ofsted in my chair of governor capacity, and we're looking at the curriculum that is taught within that primary school in a very white British working class community where I grew up, we're making sure that our curriculum isn't just focused on the industries and the businesses and the job opportunities around us, but also going further in terms of the different communities. And we're making sure that the children are going out of town pre-lockdown and COVID, naturally, and visiting different places and looking at history of different cultures to make sure that they are seeing that diversity through education where they won't be seeing it in their home lives. It cuts. I could talk for hours. It cuts across so many different things. But I think we need to enable people to be brave enough to have a conversation. And if they get it wrong, let's not hang them out for it. Let's just say, yeah, okay, I understand what you're saying. However, in future, you might want to address it like this, or, you might want to speak to me in a different way. Just give people that empowerment and that autonomy to have the conversation. If they get it wrong, they'll learn from that and they'll have a better quality conversation the next time around.
Brilliant. Jeff, looking at the history side, has history played a damaging part potentially in some of the negative aspects of where we see things at the moment, and where the fear for some people comes from?
Yeah, history damages us, doesn't it? But it also makes us. When I look back at my particular history, I went to school at a time when there's a program on television called Roots, and my perception of myself in certain circumstances was that I've been a slave. So I could spend my whole life being a slave. But then I was also in a school where I did Latin, and as part of the Latin curriculum, I was taught that the Roman emperors some of them were black. In fact, the guy who ran Hadrian's Wall was black, and half the soldiers were black. This guy in ran Hadrian's Wall is a black man. He's an emperor, and he's in charge of all these white people. So therefore, instead of being a slave, I could be an emperor. So history and it depends who teaches it and how it's taught. That's it's a phenomenal tool, education. And back to that previous point though about the internet. Internet is also a tool, and it's through the curriculum that we give people the opportunity to have those conversations, to really understand how to use that tool, how to take from it what's good, and how to put away what's bad. And that's through the education, that's through the curriculum, as other colleagues were saying. And again, if in our curriculum we show the same information from diverse perspectives, that again helps us get that rounded picture of history. Because the history that we've had about, say for example, about black people is that they were all slaves. We have a history about gay people. We forget the power of what some gay people have done. Turing, for example, things that really important people have done. Somehow that's put aside. We need to educate people from all perspectives so they have those diverse views, and they will make up their own truth based on that. And as Dan was saying, the more perspectives we get into young people at a very, very early age, they become very, very rounded. It's what we feed them, what we get out of them. So I think history, the way it has been taught, can be damaging. If we rethink how we teach things like history, how we teach things like sex education, etc., it could be really powerful and enabling for young people.
So look, staying on the curriculum then, has the recent overhaul of the RSHE aspect of the curriculum, has it gone far enough? Is there still further steps to travel on that? Is it, is it wide enough, and is it inclusive enough for, to get that rounded aspect for young people now? Sidoni?
So it's significant progress considering where we were with the legacy of Section 28 being repealed, but it also could go further. When we talk to LGBTQ plus young people, we know that about only 13% have learned about how to have healthy relationships that apply to the relationships that they will end up having later on in life. And we know that fewer than 20% of LGBT pupils have learned about consent, intimate partner violence, or abuse in same-sex relationships from our research. We also know that LGBTQ people want to learn about safe sex, consent, and healthy relationships, and they want to see a range of gender identities and sexual and romantic orientations reflected in the teaching that they receive. So that's pretty good, and there is further for us to go. But in addition, true inclusion wouldn't just be that you know that you're not supposed to do homophobic, biphobic, transphobic bullying language, and that you see yourselves reflected in relationship, sex, and health education. It would be being included in maths and in history and in science and in chemistry and in art and in every other curriculum. Not in a tokenistic way, but in a way that shows that you can be. There are so many ways to be yourself, and there are so many possibilities for you. So it goes further than it has been before, but there is also just so much more that we should be doing, really.
If you treat people differently, they feel different. And again, through education, we can change that. I fundamentally agree with Sidoni's comment there, and making sure that when you're doing something, it isn't tokenistic. And one of the key things we've done internally, which was and the chief executive of the organisation joined. He did like a welcome to our Equality and Diversity Inclusion Committee, and he's basically said to myself as the chair in the committee, it's our responsibility to hold him and our senior leadership to account around diversity, inclusion, and equity within our workforce, which for me is very powerful, because you need that commitment from the top of your organisation to drive that through. But not doing something just for the sake of doing it. And it's Pride Month this month, okay? And one of the things I said to the marketing team is, don't just change the logo for a rainbow logo for the sake of ticking a box. If you're going to do it with some meaning, because otherwise it becomes tokenistic and it means nothing. So if you're going to change the logo on a website or our social media platforms, say why you're doing it and what Pride stands for within our organisation, and why our workforce are proud to work for our organisation. Things have got to have meaning, and I think if you look at the RSHE, it is getting better, and we are enabling our educators to have better quality conversations within schools at a young age. That shouldn't just happen within education. It should happen within businesses. It should happen against decision making. And again, through the power of education, enabling people to have better quality conversations without risk is so important.
Dan will remember this. We held one of the things we do for your companies, our employers, is that we hold quarterly workshops for them. And the previous one that we did in May was about building a solid employee and apprentice resource group. One of the key parts of that was accountability. How do we keep organizations accountable for the thing? Because before for the DEI agenda. Now, traditionally, what we've done is what we've traditionally seen is that we have a DEI leader, and he or she does some initiative, and they go out there, and then that's the company's done their job. It's done their job. The reality of it is that it's fulfilled a purpose for a particular month, for a particular period, for a particular purpose and particular objective. When you take that one or two things away, you realize you're actually not left with nothing. You're left with really little, and then you've got to turn back around and say, well, how do we keep the organization accountable? This is why when we say when any organization builds a network, it has to be that there has to be a level of accountability that is led from bottom upwards, not top down, because top down controls the purse strings, bottom upwards can control the action element of it, because that's where the action happens, is because the top has to sign it off, etc. And that's why we say where the best form of accountability is your own employees. To do that, you've got to create a culture that allows an organization to allow that to happen. If you have an organization that is built on bravado and no accountability, whereby when there's an element of accountability, you're fearful. It's very commonplace that when an organization is held accountable internally, that they get rid of the individual. That can't happen. This practice, if in the DEI space, is so commonplace, and it needs to stop. So we've got to go back to the original, because you've got to realize, as was mentioned by Sydney, that it's for the if we're talking about inclusivity, we're talking about an individual who are there to thrive and succeed in the organization. If we're not keeping people accountable, then we will never reach that target. All we will do is have tick box exercises. But tick box exercise will get found out eventually, because the situation last year, the whole of last year, so many organizations got found out, because if you look at all the initiatives around, they're all tick boxes, but the reality was presented a different picture. So the reality will come out eventually, and it will come out in a time when nobody's ready for it.
I think what we're edging towards is a conversation about a whole setting approach, about changing the culture or influencing the culture. Because the truth is, it's not just in the curriculum or in the leadership team or in the staff network group or pupil network group. It exists somewhere, I think, across all of those things. And that's the work that exists beyond the values that you see on the website, or that the presentations or photos that you see as you walk through a setting, like as a physical space. I think some ways that you can think about accountability is by thinking about benchmark schemes. So Stonewall's got two. One is for organisations as employers, about how LGBTQ plus inclusive they are, and then one for how that impacts your learners, for example. So those are just two examples, and there are many, many more. But I also think it's about allyship and about power. If you happen to be somebody who doesn't identify with any protected characteristic but are a leader, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't take diversity seriously. It's about thinking about whose voices you're listening to, how you can share your power, and how you're really fundamentally doing that change and that hard work. And it is hard because of the legacy of history that we find ourselves in, to make really meaningful change. And then I'd say, like, a really good benchmark of whether you're doing this work well, if you have access to young people, is to ask your learners to hold you to account, to ask them what they think, because what leaders think is happening in a setting, for example, and then what the learners think is happening in a setting is completely different sometimes.
Yeah, again, picking up on what colleagues have been saying, I think you're right, Siddhani. We are heading towards this conversation about a cultural change. There are lots of tokenistic things which take place, and we can tick the box and we can mark it off as having been done. But the real change comes around when we're no longer working at an intellectual level, but we're also working at an emotional level, and when we actually feel as though we belong in organizations, we feel comfortable having those uncomfortable conversations, and know that we're not going to be put at risk. And I think it starts from the top within organizations, as someone was saying about the accountability. When leaders begin opening up that space and almost standing back and letting the bottom-up approach take place, it's scary for leaders, but actually what you do is you help the staff feel comfortable in having those conversations, and then that permeates through. People have more and more uncomfortable conversations, and they get to a point where they understand who the allies are. They get to a point where they understand what they should be able to say and what they can't say, and what hurts someone else and what doesn't hurt someone. So I think we're moving in that direction. It is very slow because, from my perspective, lots of our leaders have come through a very logical. I've got nothing against MBA training, but it allows you to think logically, do business plans, and 101 makes two. Whereas where we're at the moment, we're looking for creative solutions. We're looking for people who think differently, who are able to stand back and lead from behind sometimes, lead from the side. And that takes a very, very different type of leadership. I believe it will come, but it's coming very slow because we're still caught up in that almost 20th century mindset about how we have leaders who are in command, who can make decisions, and who can lead from the front. So I'm agreeing with Sophie. We need change. It's coming far too slowly, and it's about the shape of our leadership which will make that happen.
Talking about moving slowly, we've actually moved quite quickly. We're not far away from, ending this fantastic chat. Two questions I want to pose. First one is the last question I want you to think about, and it's the usual one that I throw out. What could you change if you could, or what do we need more of in order to make sure that we continue the progress and that it doesn't falter in any way, shape, or form. Talking about leaders and leadership, obviously the big question is, has the government got things right themselves? Are they being leaders? Hands up, left, right, and centre. Are they doing the right thing, or do they really need to do more themselves in order to show that the changes can happen and positive things can actually occur? Dan first.
So, we do have a Minister for Women and Equalities, which is the Right Honourable Elizabeth Truss. And I think through her work, she's developing equality policy based on dignity and individual autonomy, which is good, and also promoting equality of opportunities for people. What I think there needs to be is cross-governmental policy around the work that the Minister for Equalities is doing alongside other government departments. So if you think about, within education, the skills bill, for example, the FE white paper, was there an equality impact analysis done on some of those recommendations to ensure that we're not marginalising or excluding people from some of those policy decisions in relation to education and reform? So I think the fact that we have a Minister for Equalities is the government doing something, which is great. But I think there needs to be cross-governmental department collaboration and a more collegiate approach to embedding some of the policies within diversity, inclusion, and autonomy and dignity across other government departments. Even things like the Department for Work and Pensions, the Education Skills Funding Agency, what are they doing within their own agendas that then could be changed for the better when they apply? And I think it's what Sidoni mentioned earlier, that lens. So, if they were to look at something through a different lens, what would they change?
If I was to keep it sort of slightly relevant to the work the field I'm in, about 3 years ago, 2018, the government launched the 5 Cities project, which was the increasing Black, Asian, and ethnic talent in apprenticeships and really a focus around 5 cities: Birmingham, Greater Birmingham, Greater Manchester, Leicester, Bristol, and London. And fantastic initiative, really, really good initiative, because it's a starting point. The government put a figure of £125,000 towards the essentially the cities. Now, when I say £125,000, I mean £125,000 across the 5 cities. So that's £21,000 per city. Now, when I began assessing, so for purpose of transparency, I accessed some of that funding. We accessed really about 1% or 2% of it, and we worked with about 90 kids from minority, underrepresented talent, and we did a lot of workshops with them, etc. And one of the things, when we went back to government, we went back to our local body to better understand. Right, that's what we've done. What has everybody else done about it? And people held conferences, people held so on and so forth. Fundamentally, what we saw from that was that because there was lack of accountability, coming back to the terminology we just used, of that money, it was seen as a tick box exercise uh, 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 by central government, really, um, to kind of put some money out there and do something about it. It didn't do anything. In fact, it didn't achieve anything. What it did do was understand that there was something being done. The good thing is that government recognised that and they've scrapped that. The bad thing is that we don't know what's happened. There's public money being used attached to regional projects. I mean, I recall one city using about 70% of their funding on a conference to talk to employers about why. Well, have we not had that for about 4 years straight, where we've had employer conferences, and I've done that on £100. I've done that for There's so many of these things going on. Why are we repeating everything? What we really need is to fundamentally fund social enterprises or community organizations who are embedded in the ground, whereby they have the people already there who need the support that they need to get into high quality jobs. They need the skills, they need opportunities, not to go through the traditional means, because the traditional means are not working. Traditional means meaning you fund a large organization in a particular area, and then they'll do the thing, they'll meet the target, and that's it. Why is it that we've done that for so long and we've not actually achieved anything when it comes to the EDI agenda? It's because everybody's fulfilling a certain target and then moving on. It's got to be a strong accountability to say, if you've not achieved, or if you've not worked with community organizations, then you're not fulfilling the needs of the communities you're trying to serve. Particularly, one last thing I would say from government perspective, I'm glad that government have recognised that more needs to be done in this space. We just need to know what their next move is, because they're quite silent about it.
I think if you think about the priorities of institutions and organisations, it is generally led by government and policies, and then by resource. So lots of schools and colleges are doing great work in LGBTQ plus inclusion, for example, but they could be doing so much more if they had a bit more resource, a bit more time. They're very stretched. We know that there's a mental health crisis. We know that lots of young people aren't in educational work or training, and we know that there's very little research into LGBTQ young people who aren't in education, work or training. And we did some, and we found that the people who faced the most barriers to re-entry were those who had multiple intersecting identities, so were LGBTQ plus and disabled, and the workplaces, their employers, and the education settings or training settings they were engaging with didn't understand them or weren't able to support them, and they didn't feel comfortable to come out, or if they did, then it felt risky. So I think that there is a lot more that can be done, but I guess I would say it's Stonewall does do like lobbying, and we do ask and work with the government, but I would say don't wait for it. There is so much that you can do on the basis of the Equality Act. There is so much work that needs to be done, and I yes, I think if you adopt this whole setting approach, there are usually a couple of quick wins, and then there is some longer term pieces of work. And so if you get started and the ball rolling, I think that would be my priority. But that's probably because I'm a very practical person.
From a government perspective, I think is that we have a fragmented system. We talk about levelling up, which to me is simply about providing the equity for individuals and for communities that they deserve. We talk about health, we talk about poverty and education, we talk about well-being. All these are quite separate funding lines, separate government lines. If we stopped thinking about diversity and inclusion as a problem, but as a means to get some of these things done well and done better and done differently, that might really change the game. So the one thing I'd like to see us stop doing is thinking of diversity and inclusion as a problem and thinking of it as a solution to things like levelling up. We have lots of diverse thought out there that could really make an impact through innovative ideas to help us to level up. Accepting that inclusion is a solution will help with our safeguarding issues within schools and within our colleges. It opens up the space for those conversations and totally impacts on well-being. An inclusive curriculum, again, does the same thing, helps with those conversations within organisations. Once we begin levelling up and having that equity, that impacts on poverty, it impacts on our health agenda. So I just think that there must come a time soon when government thinks holistically and stops thinking in these particular funding lines, which are probably Treasury based. So that's my hope, my ambition, is that we look at things holistically.
Wonderful. Okay, so the last question. What one thing, I mean, I think you've touched on it, but what one thing, what change, what definite item would you want to see to make sure that it's not just that tick box exercise, it's not the tokenistic thing, it's sustainable, it's business as usual, and it's there all the time. We don't need to think about it. It's part of us. It becomes our DNA. Isa, I'll start with you.
I would say that we need some form of a law that or some form of legislation that ensures companies are representative of the communities they serve. I know it sounds quite harsh, but I think it's probably the best way really that we can actually get action moving, because I mean that's probably the one thing I would say.
For me, it's around don't ridicule or judge someone for having a go and trying to have that conversation. People want to embrace diversity and inclusion and equality. We're not always going to get it right, but let's not jump on them and hang them out for giving it a go. So I think we need more acceptance within equality, diversity, and inclusion for people who are trying and have got a journey to go on themselves.
I think start doing the work. It might seem big, but start looking at it and building it into the work that you already do around your strategies. And then I would say, introduce your pronouns, put them in your email signature. Don't make a scenario where people have to assume what pronouns you use, and that automatically makes the setting so much more trans-inclusive.
Following on from Sidoni's idea of keeping things simple, I said before what I think government should do is about thinking of diversity and inclusion as a solution, not as a problem. And from a personal level, simply talk to strangers. You never know what you'll find out.
Yeah, definitely. I'm always one for talking to anybody that I meet, and I absolutely love it. Fabulous. Thank you all so very much. It's just trundled on past 12 o'clock there. We've had a fantastic conversation. Thank you all. In no particular order, I'd like to thank our guests for today. So just to make sure I get the titles right. So it's Isa Mutlib, the Chief Exec of the BAMI Apprenticeship Alliance. Jeff Greenwich, Head of Equality and Diversity at the Education and Training Foundation. Siddhani Sadoni, Head of Education and Youth at Stonewall. And Daniel, it's got your full name here, mate. Dan Howard, Chair, Diversity Inclusion Team, NCFE. A wonderful conversation. As usual, we could have gone on for much, much longer. And I would like to return sometime in the future, to this conversation and see where we've got, what's happened, and the progression that we'll hopefully make.
Thank you for listening to the NCFE podcast. You can find out more about NCFE, our guests, and supporting information and links relating to this topic at ncfe.org.uk/podcast.